So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Leon Lenchik. This is the second webinar of the Research Mentor Academy. This is funded by the AUR R&E Foundation. Today we're going to talk about the middle of the mentor-mentee relationship. We had an earlier webinar on the beginning, and we'll have a later webinar on the end. The format is just as last time. The first 45 minutes will be recorded and put on the website. The last 15 minutes will be entirely private and confidential. Just as last time, we had some pre-reading assignments, and we will have some post-webinar suggestions for how to proceed. Just like last time, the moderators are myself from Wake Forest and Georgianne McGinnis from NYU. Both of us have extensive mentoring experience in the research domain, both within radiology and outside of radiology. We follow the best practices for this webinar, those of the Wake Forest CTSI Mentor Academy, those of the National Research Mentoring Network, and those of the NYU mentoring programs. The goal for this webinar and others is to focus on the mentor side of the mentor-mentee relationship, to share some practical strategies on how you can improve your mentoring, and really encourage you to personally reflect on the process. So as you participate in these webinars, remind yourself to ask yourself the questions of what I'm listening to, what it all means to me, and most importantly, what I'm going to do about it as I approach other future mentor-mentee relationship. So I'll turn it over to Georgianne to give us the plan for the day.
Good morning, everybody. So the plan for today is to build upon the overarching themes that were discussed at our last session, which was focused on starting up the relationship. In all of these cases, in continuation of the relationship, are predicated on maintaining strong and effective lines of communication. We're also going to focus a bit on conflict resolution, conflict being a term maybe a little bit different than how you think of it in traditional senses. In the setting of mentoring. So we're going to touch on the foundations for effective communication, and these include, importantly, active listening, reframing and redirecting conversations, the importance of body language when you're interacting with your mentee. We're going to present strategies to improve communication and discuss communication styles across diverse dimensions. This can impact widely on the effectiveness of your mentoring. We'll present approaches to challenging communications, providing constructive feedback, and again, approaches to conflict resolution. Next slide, please.
I'm stuck, Carrie. Hold on, give me a second. There I am, sorry.
Okay, so I think it's safe to bet with this group that we're talking to today that we've all had some exposure to presentations about effective communication. So we do presumably at least understand the basics. But what we'll try to do today is revisit these things that we know as they apply specifically to research mentoring. Interestingly, at the Wake Forest Mentor Academy, participants were surveyed, and the feedback that they got was when participants were asked to score themselves, they gave themselves very high scores, self-assessment scores, on active listening and providing constructive feedback, but at the same time, there was a strong sense that they wanted to improve communication skills. This was viewed as a top priority item. So in summary, most mentors feel very positive about their communication skills, but at the same time, they recognize that there's room for improvement.
All right, so let me kind of jump into this first section, which focuses on some ideas on how you can improve effective communication. So good communication is a key element of any relationship. So mentoring relationships, other work relationships, relationships at home, all benefit when you take a little bit of time and reflect on communication. So good communications help develop a positive relationship with your mentee, helps the mentee understand your feedback better, and mentees really appreciate mentors who are approachable and not judgmental. And mentees, surprisingly, often remember more about how a subject is communicated rather than the actual subject. And this is true across all communication domains, not just in the mentor-mentee relationship. So what we encourage you to do when you embark on your next mentoring project is at least try to pay some attention to the nonverbal communication process. So nonverbal communication accounts for about 90% of human communication. It involves every kind of body language that you can think of, and it really reveals what we're thinking and feeling. So as you mentor, remember that you're projecting both verbally and nonverbally, and also pay attention to the nonverbal cues that your mentee is sending to you as you're communicating with them. So what are some of those cues? Well, again, we're all instinctively programmed to recognize them, and although there are some cultural difference, in general, eye contact, open, relaxed posture, some nodding or other forms of affirmation, and a pleasant facial expression is considered positive. And the negative ones I won't go through, but I think you can use your imagination. So when you're mentoring, try to focus on kind of having that positive body language because the mentees will certainly recognize it and appreciate it. So in terms of kind of the nuts and bolts of communication skills, again, some of you have had this in other presentations and courses. Sometimes the nomenclature is not consistent across the literature. But again, to kind of break down the process into individual parts, what you want to do when you interact with mentees is active listening. So you don't want to be distracted. You don't want to be thinking about what you had for lunch or what you're going to have for dinner. You want to be fully engaged in the interaction. You want to be attending, and you want to be communicating your attentiveness to them. And this is where affirmation, saying, yes, I see, nodding, eye contact can be especially valuable. So you want to make a connection, a nonverbal connection with the listener. The next thing is reflective listening. This is where you actually verbally affirm that you understand the mentee. It helps them feel understood. So you would say something like, it seems that you're overwhelmed with your workload. And there are many other ways to do it. So, for example, paraphrasing is another way to accomplish the same thing. You could say something, you're interested in developing a better MRI coil. So now you just rephrased what the mentee was telling you. Summarizing, a very similar concept. So you pick certain points and you bring them together. So you say something like, let me see if I understand. You said that the main challenge is balancing clinical and research. So this sounds kind of corny and almost stilted and forced, but the more you think about it and the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes. The other very valuable tool for communication in any domain is open-ended questions. So I struggle this with my teenage son, for example, whether every question I ask gets a monosyllabic answer, yes, no, grunt, maybe. So the way you avoid that is you take a close-ended question, like you didn't think that protocol would work. That's easily answered with a yes, no, and replace it with an open-ended question, such as what factors led you to change the protocol. That open-ended question cannot be answered with a yes or no, so it forces the listener to become engaged in the conversation, and that's exactly what you're striving for. Other things you can try is probing. So you identify a topic and you ask them to clarify. So you say, you're overwhelmed, please tell me more. Next is self-disclosure. Now this one has to be done with caution because as you share appropriate personal experiences, sometimes you drift towards storytelling. So you need to kind of do this one in moderation, but if you have something that you can reflect, that can help you form a connection. Interpreting is important, and this is the one that we all do very well because we think that mentoring is about facts. So we would say something, well, have you thought about statistics, or how about the other statistics, or we kind of redirect them from thinking about one dimension to another. The other is confrontation, where you actually encourage mentees to change their course, but do so in an appropriate way without judging or devaluing them. So you would say something like, it's great that you're mentoring somebody younger, but I'm concerned that you're not really paying attention to your own work. So those are kind of the positive things to work on. The negative things are perhaps even more important to keep in mind. And again, these cross all communication domains, not just at work, but everywhere, really. So blocking communication is something that we all do, and we all should try to do less of. So aggressive voice, impatience, annoyance, having an authoritative manner makes mentees feel humiliated, scared, or insecure. They may become passive, not ask questions, distrust you, disregard your advice, and that's all the things that we're trying to avoid when we mentor. For obvious reason, we want to avoid moralizing, arguing, and preaching. The other thing is storytelling. Now, for people of certain age, like myself, we tend to have a story that seems to fit every occasion, whether it's relevant or not. And it's really kind of takes a lot of mental energy to remind ourselves everything doesn't need a story unless it's short and relevant. And the other, again, pitfall that I fall into daily, and that's excessive talking, where you dominate the conversation because you think you're the great expert and you have so much wisdom to share, and your mentee gets lost and doesn't have enough time to ask questions and interact. So the final point that we'll make in this section is the issue of diversity. So all of us live in environments that are diverse in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity, generation and age, cultural and professional backgrounds, and various levels of power. And that introduces a whole new level of complexity and difficulty when we communicate effectively. There are many different strategies on how to cope with this. We're just going to share one with you today, and it's called acknowledgement statements. So an acknowledgement statement is any statement that shows that you are struggling to understand. So you're exerting some effort to understand not the facts of the conversation, but the emotional content of what your mentee is saying, and that's critical. This is what helps you establish empathy across diverse domains, across people who don't look like you or sound like you. So some of the expressions that you can try using is, it sounds like you're really upset about this. This really seems important to you. If I were in your shoes, I'd probably feel angry or upset or worried too. So this shows your mentee that you're connecting with them on an emotional level, not just the factual level. And this in particular is useful when you try to communicate with people who may not share the same background as you. So our core belief in this program is, as research mentors, it's not enough for us to say, well, this is good communication and this is bad communication. Rather, it's critical that we actually spend some time thinking about the process, and more importantly, we should take some time practicing this when we embark on our next relationship. So let me stop here for a minute and open up the lines, Carrie, please, and see if any of the participants have questions for us on what we've covered so far. Any comments or questions from the audience?
I have a question. I am concerned sometimes when if I'm mentoring someone who comes from a diverse background, group of which I'm not a member, and I try to express empathy and kind of relate to them on some fundamental level, I'm concerned that I come across as patronizing. Have you had that experience, Dr. Linczyk?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful point, and it needs to be made. I don't know. I have experienced it. I don't know what the right solution to it is. Right. So it basically becomes an issue of moderation, and becomes an issue of judgment, because you can go into either extreme, right? You can completely treat them as, inanimate objects almost, because they're different from you, or you can go overboard in terms of trying to relate and come across as patronizing. So So yeah, that's a difficult trick to pull off. I think, you know, it's a little bit actually easier to do, I think, in a work environment, in a professional environment, rather than in a outside of work. And I think some of the strategy that kind of we suggested of this communication might help. But that's great point. All right, let's move on to a case discussion. This case is so long we've broken it up into two sections, but I think it's useful to spend a few minutes talking about it. So let me read the case, not because you can't read, but just to kind of emphasize certain points. So Dr. Tariq tells Dr. Timms that he'll see her in a few minutes after she was the last presenter in a practice session. Back in his office, Dr. Tariq sits distractedly looking out of the window, releases a heavy sigh, looks at the notes from the last time he reviewed her, and mumbles things like reading slides too fast, too long, too much. Dr. Timms then comes in. She plops in a chair across from him and looks up expectantly. He meets her gaze and smiles and says, "I want to review your talk since the conference is coming up and I'm getting to go out of town." She continues to stare at him without comment, blank expression on her face. He continues, "I think your research is important. The conference will be great. I do think there are some problems." Dr. Timms nods slightly, shifts in her seat. Dr. Tariq keeps the focus on the notes that he brought from the prior meeting and continues. For example, you had some long sentences, even whole paragraphs on the slides. You may want to shorten them. His computer chimes in with a new email. He reads it, mumbling to himself, "Oh no, not again," and then continues, "As I was saying, it's really too much text for one slide. You can try to shorten. You can still make those points without reading your slides." So that's kind of the opening to their interaction. We'll close it a little bit later, but let's just, again, open the lines and ask the audience for some questions in terms of, you know, how can you communicate constructively with a mentee whose progress is somehow disappointing? And perhaps more importantly, how do you communicate in a way that actually results in a change of behavior? And why do you think some mentees have difficulty receiving negative feedback? So let's open up the lines and see if anybody has any comments on that.
Sure. You know, I'm happy to start the conversation. Really, in this case, what really struck me was that it was a one-sided conversation. Dr. Tariq did all the talking. As a mentor, he was not listening to Dr. Timms or giving her the chance to respond, asking open-ended questions about how she thought the practice presentation went, and having an interactive discussion that way rather than going straight to his notes. The other thing, it seemed like there was a loss of nonverbal cues and really picking up on those. You know, she was plopping into her chair and had a blank expression on her face. And as a mentor, you would kind of want to pick up on those things and really address the emotional side of what's going on here and see if Dr. Tariq is willing to open up to you.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and I kind of made another slide that just kind of shows in yellow the different nonverbals that are going on in the conversation. So there are nonverbals on both the mentor's and the mentee's part, right? So the mentor is distracted. He doesn't want to be there. He has a heavy sigh. The mentee doesn't want to be there too, and she displays that with body language too. She plops in the chair. She doesn't talk much, has a blank expression. She's uncomfortable, shifting in her seat. So I think as mentors, you know, we need to be kind of self-aware of our nonverbals, but we also need to be aware of the mentee's nonverbals. And this is clearly not happening in this case. So let's see how the interaction ends, and then we'll have a few more minutes for comments. So Dr. Tariq looks up and sees that Dr. Timms is now looking at the floor. He says, "Increase the font size a bit. It was hard to read from the back of the room." He looks up again and sees that she's taking some notes. He says, I think you can cut some slides from the background. He waits for her comment, and the silence drags. He asks her pointedly, what do you think? She answers, I can look at it, but her face remains expressionless, although she tries to briefly meet his eye. He continues, it's natural to be nervous, and when you do, you talk faster. Perhaps you can practice a bit. Have you been practicing at home? She says, yes, monosyllabic answer. The phone rings. He checks caller ID, says, I have to call her back. Okay, then, I'll send you some tips on how to improve your slides. There's another long moment of silence. He asks, do you have questions for me? Not right now. Okay, then, well, good luck. He forces a smile, reaches out to shake her hand as she gets up. She takes it, feebly smiling, and again, short answer, thanks. So, you know, communicating across diverse dimensions is trickier, as we already talked about, and you know, they have a gender differential here. I'm not sure there's definitely a power differential here. But kind of more broadly, you know, how can you tell that she's paying attention to what he's saying would be one thing. The other thing is, do you have to adjust your feedback if your mentee is from a different background than yours? And perhaps more importantly for this particular case, you know, is it too late now, or is there an opportunity for the mentor here to still kind of redirect and save the process at this stage? So let's open it up to discussion and see if anybody have any comments.
So I think there is still the possibility for kind of salvaging this communication, and I think it really comes down to the mentor kind of probing for answers from the mentee and possibly asking her to briefly summarize in her own words her understanding of what needs to be done here. And then maybe, you know, there are distractions like the phone rings, he's going out of town possibly, but it would still be on the mentor's side, his responsibility to be available for additional practice and not leaving it up completely to the mentee to fix any issues with the presentation.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And, you know, what I love about this case is, you know, if you just look at his communication in terms of factual information, it's exactly on target, right? I mean, I've had this conversation, the same exact conversation with my trainees, you know, multiple times a year, probably before every single meeting that they present at, right? So how to fix your slides, I mean, all that stuff that he says is factually completely on target, but the problem is that she's not paying attention to it. She's completely distracted for whatever reason, and he's not able to get past that roadblock in the communication. So he tries to just do a knee-jerk say and say, do you have a question? But either the way he asks it or the timing of the question just doesn't work, right? So that's what I think is so great about this case, is because it's really not you know, some kind of a hypothetical scenario that never comes up. It's a very, very common pitfall that we've all been in and will continue to be in unless we pay attention to and make kind of a decision of how to avoid these kind of things.
And you bring up a very good point. The problem here, the communication breakdown here, didn't just start at the time of this interaction in his office, because the scenario starts out, he's reviewing his notes from the last time, and it's the exact same comments. So she hasn't responded from the time before when she gave a presentation somewhere, and she's making the same mistakes. That's setting the conversation up for failure because he feels frustrated. My valuable feedback to her is being ignored. She comes in, and timing, as somebody said, is very important. You know, you have to pick the right time to give mentees feedback. If you give them feedback about a talk right before they're going to give the talk and there isn't sufficient time to rehearse, it's only going to rattle them. So maybe the thing to do is, as one of the call-ins suggested, I think they're both going to the conference. Say, hey, why don't we meet the afternoon before your morning presentation and, you know, work on it at home over the weekend, and then we can rehearse it again. She'll feel better about it.
Yeah, exactly right. And those are great points. So I think as we move forward, when mentoring, effective communication is more than just giving factual information and giving advice. I mean, mentoring is a human relationship setting. We have to ask questions, we have to listen, and we have to try to understand the mentee's concerns. Now, whatever is bothering that person in the case, we may never find out, but it's going to shape the relationship. And sometimes it's a legitimate issue, sometimes it's an illegitimate issue, sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's inappropriate, but we won't find out until we actually probe it and try to get the mentee to open up and figure out what the obstacle is to the communication. So that's a great segue to our next section, which is about challenging communications. So communication challenges come up in mentor-mentee relationships as they do with others. Not all of them are conflicts, and the word conflict is perhaps a loaded word, and we'll try to unpack it in a few minutes. But the coping strategies that mentors commonly use for conflict resolution are really three. Some mentors, and I'm in this group, avoid conflict at all costs. The second group becomes completely consumed by conflict, so they become emotionally engaged in it, they get angry, abrupt, etc. The third, perhaps the smallest group, are the group of mentors that actually apparently enjoy conflict and enjoy the confrontation. Problem with this approach is their mentees are almost guaranteed not to enjoy it. So the best way to resolve these conflicting interactions is through conversation. We'll talk about the conversation strategies in a second, but just to kind of show some sources of conflict that I'm sure all of you have already encountered. Mentee not meeting expectation, didn't meet deadlines, mentee has problems with other people in the team, lab workers, etc., technologists. Mentee continues to make excuses rather than to progress as expected. Mentee doesn't take responsibility for the project, either going well or usually going not so well. And then the mentor side of the relationship also is a source of potential disagreement and conflict. So most of us as mentors are overextended, so our availability is perhaps the biggest issue that comes up. The second is, we as mentors frequently see ourselves as kind of being on a high horse, and, we've seen it, done it, and we tend to be intimidating to people even when we don't intend to be. I see that with residents in the reading room all the time. I think of myself as the most approachable and easygoing person, but they look at me as like I'm some kind of a threat that's going to fire them if they read the film wrong. So that's a hard thing to resolve. So how do you turn a difficult conversation into a positive direction? Well, this is adapted from the Difficult Conversations book, which we read for the Wake Forest Mentor Academy, and it really gives some good advice. So the first bit of advice is every conversation, every hard conversation is really three separate conversations. The first is the most obvious. That's the fact-finding. You're trying to figure out what happened and what happened that didn't go as planned, etc. But there are two conversations underneath it. The first is the feeling conversation. So both you and your mentee have certain emotional perspective on the events that transpired, and almost by definition they're not going to be perfectly in sync. The second is the identity conversation. So again, by definition, if there is a conflict, both your identity and the mentee's identity is at least partially threatened. and that affects how the conflict will be resolved. So the goal for you as the mentor is to change kind of the fact-finding, the message delivery conversation into a learning conversation. So the 3 reasons to have a learning conversation with your mentee when you encounter trouble is so you can, number 1, learn their story, the facts, their feelings, the emotional content, and their identity issues or their views. It allows you to express your views and feelings in a non-threatening way. And then finally, what it allows you to do is to problem solve together with the mentee. So how does this work? So the message delivery stance is the one that we all know and love and use without even trying, right? Is when we're trying to prove a point, give somebody a piece of our mind, get our way, persuade others that we're right and they're wrong. So this is almost instinctual. Nobody needs practice doing this. What we need practice doing in any kind of communication environment, at home, at work, with mentors, with residents, etc., is the learning stance, right? So this is when you try to understand the other person's point of view, even if you disagree with it. So one of the ways to do this is to use kind of a third-person approach. So before you even get into the conversation, before you even start the difficult conversation with a mentee and to find out what went wrong and how it went wrong and how you're going to fix it, try to consider it first on your own, as a newspaper reporter would, kind of in a third-person point of view, and then try to practice that when you actually meet together. So here's kind of a checklist that helps you do that. You can do this checklist before you go into the difficult conversation. You can do it together during the conversation, but the point of it, again, is to give the interaction some structure, so it's not a free-for-all. So this helps you plan how it's going to go, and we'll post this on the website as well. So preparing for the 3 conversations, acknowledge that you're going to have a conversation about the events, you're going to have a conversations about emotions, and you're going to have a conversations about identity. Second, try to figure out where you're actually going, what's your purpose for this interaction, and make the appropriate decisions. Third is the third-story approach, the third-person, approach, as I spoke about before. Then you try to kind of objectively, from a third-person viewpoint, look at their facts and your facts, if you will, and listen from the standpoint of understanding. And then hopefully the very last piece is problem solving. So if that's too complex for you, this is a Cliff Notes version or a cheat sheet version that's even simpler. So you can print out the slide, put it on your desk, and these could be the prompts to you on what to say when you know the conversation is going to be uncomfortable for you and uncomfortable for the mentor. You want to ask things like, can you say a little bit more? How are you feeling about this? Were you reacting to something I did? What impact did I have? Can you say a little bit more why it's important to you? What would it mean if that happened? How do you see things differently? So kind of open-ended conversations, but show emotional concern about not just being right as the mentor, because the assumption is that you're right and they're wrong because you're mentoring them, not the other way around. But in reality, that's a conversation stopper. So you want to try to open up the conversation in a positive way and try to learn something from it. So let me pause here and take a few questions or comments if there are any.
Seems like you're kind of immune to it.
Okay. Any comments or questions at this stage?
Well, I have one. Have you ever had an experience where you feel that the communication, despite your best efforts, just wasn't coming together and you were heading towards a bad outcome? And if so, do you think that the mentee sensed it?
Okay, I'll flip.
Yeah. Carrie, Carrie, could you mute the other participants because we're having some background noise? Yeah, I mean, I think, we're all kind of instinctively know when things are going not according to plan, and And the trick is to kind of not to jump on the gerbil wheel and escalate. The trick is to kind of, you know, how to de-escalate it politely. And I mean, I don't know if this is the right approach for everybody, but what I try to do in those situations, and unfortunately I've had many of them, is I basically end the encounter on a polite note, and I say, you know, these, you know, things don't seem to be going, you know, well in this discussion. How about we meet again in a few weeks and kind of reflect on it until we meet again and just revisit the issue again when our emotions are a little bit less acute. So I try to kind of take the emotional content on it and politely redirect to another time frame. But yeah, that's important. Let's move on so we can keep our time aligned. The next section, Georgianne will present, and this is kind of a self-assessment tools that you can use to help improve your communication skills. So
one of the critical things to think about when you're doing a self-assessment, this is so obvious, but I have to say it, this is one of the times, many times in life, where you have to be unbelievably honest with yourself and demonstrate this self-insight and emotional intelligence we know you all have. Because if you don't face the fact that you are effective in some areas and ineffective in other areas, you're really never going to improve. So this lists categories of behavior and what works and what doesn't work in the 3 columns. And I'm going to focus on acceptance and empathy because we've talked a lot about nonverbal behavior and focusing attention. So acceptance and empathy applies those skills that we've already given examples of, where you are relating to the person. I think this I can understand if this makes you feel this way. Tell me more about what happens. These are very positive cues that you're giving to the mentee, and you're going to reap a lot of benefits from doing that. In the next column, in the same area, those are very negative. Failure to empathize, failure to accept that the speaker has legitimate feelings and you're not going to acknowledge them. Those are really negative messages to be sending to the mentee. Similarly, paraphrasing and summarizing, there's a lot of overlap there, but if you do it, it really advances the conversation and it strengthens the level of communication and the benefits to be reaped. Failure to do so, you risk losing the thread of the conversation, and you risk not really understanding what the mentee is trying to say to you. So those 2 areas, paraphrasing and summarizing, are something that, I mean, for me, that's one of the areas that I have to work on a lot. But these checklists are good to...
I'm having a little trouble advancing. All right.
There we go. So these checklists are very helpful to kind of keep on hand and refer to, even just keep it in a drawer on your desk before somebody comes to talk to you. Ask yourself, what are the behaviors that are very effective that you do demonstrate regularly? Don't be too hard on yourself. I bet you're good. But if there are ineffective behaviors, identify them and identify which ones you need to work on and add that to your now what list. So there are 3 major listening skills that are crucial for effective conversations: inquiry, paraphrasing, and acknowledgement. And if you review this list of specific behaviors and assess them, you're going to have a better understanding and be able to apply them. So these fall into the categories that we've already talked about. Those which relate to inquiry, understanding what's going on, paraphrasing or summarizing for clarity, and the empathy, the acknowledgement of feelings. And you can rate yourself as applying these rarely, sometimes frequently, or consistently. And hopefully, if you do this over and over again, you will see progress in these areas.
Yeah, and we'll post this on the website so you can just print it up and use it. All right, any questions or comments on this stage? All right, let's move on in the interest of time and just kind of have some concluding thoughts. I love this quote. It says, most people do not listen with intent to understand, they listened with the intent to reply. And this really is kind of at the root of a lot of the communication troubles that we encounter in life. So in this Mentor Academy, our goal is really to give you the opportunity to think about how you mentor and make some changes as a result. So we try to give you an assignment at the end of each webinar. This week's homework is identify 3 areas that you can do better in terms of communication, and try to actually practice them. So these are our areas that we've been struggling with. They're not going to be the same for you, but unless you write it down and unless you have it somewhere on your desk when you have your next mentee encounter, you're not going to use it. So with that, I'd like to thank the Wake Forest CTSI team that ran the Mentor Academy, in particular Anita Pulley and Deborah Diz. If you're looking for resources for yourself as mentor, I highly recommend the Difficult Conversations book, which was required reading for us in the Wake Forest Academy. If you want something shorter, the Great Courses company has 2 excellent series on communication. The TED Talks are excellent. If you just go onto TED Talks and type in communications, you can see some great. If you're looking for resources about communications, differences between men and women, you can check out Deborah Tannen's book, He Said, She Said, is excellent. So there are a lot of resources in this domain. And the beauty of this conversation issue is that it doesn't have to be limited to medicine. So you can cross-fertilize your personal life and professional life as you learn about these matters. So I thank you for the formal part. We're exactly on time at 45 past the hour. Carrie will stop the recording, and we can do our informal discussion for the next 15 minutes. And to help orient that discussion, I just threw up some questions here. We don't have to follow these. We can follow really any. There's really no agenda for this informal part. So Carrie, if you can open up the lines, and we'll see what we get.
Yes. Hey, this is Keith Smith. I want to jump to the last thing on the slide, the email issue, because that's something that trips me up often, and I think also my coworkers and mentees is the sort of the email that starts hurt feelings or triggers some sort of escalation of whatever problems are going on. And if you have some